TV. We ask that you send your questions to this email address, and yes, it's League of Women Voters New Ulm, but I'll spell it out for you. lwvnewlm@lwvmn.org, or call one of these phone numbers, 507-276-6140 or 507-766-9581. Our candidates tonight will answer questions presented from the audience members and from the League of Women Voters, using a nonpartisan, unbiased, and impartial format established by the League of Women Voters of Minnesota. Our purpose is to create an opportunity for the public to hear the candidates discuss issues of importance in this 16B Republican primary election. And by the way, the election is August 11th. Our audience tonight includes those listening on KNUJ Radio or watching on Facebook Live and New Ulm Community Access Television. We do screen the questions we receive. We may rephrase, combine, or eliminate questions to avoid duplication. Questions will not be asked if they are of a personal nature and not relevant to the office, or if they are designed only to make a statement rather than solicit information. Our intention in screening the questions is to select questions that represent the interests of the persons who submitted the questions. Please contact the candidates, though, directly after the forum for any questions that have not been presented, or if you feel that an issue has not been adequately addressed, or if you simply want to talk with them more about the issues. There are two candidates running in this Republican 16B primary election for the Minnesota Legislature. Mrs. Tammy Houle and Mr. Paul Torkelson. We look forward to a respectful learning experience. The candidates are expected to honor time limits. Each candidate will introduce themselves with a short statement of 1.5 minute time limit. We will start introductions with Linda. Did you flip a coin?
It's on your candidate grid.
It's on what?
The candidate grid. I went alphabetical, so that would be Ms. Houle.
Okay, Ms. Houle. Okay. Okay, we will begin with Ms. Houle, Mrs. Houle, and then on to Mr. Torkelson, and then that means that Representative Torkelson will proceed first with closing remarks. So, opening, closing. Upon completion of the introductions, each candidate will be given 2 minutes to respond to questions which I will read. I will alternate the order of response, so each candidate will answer first on alternative questions. The candidates each have an opportunity to offer a 1-minute rebuttal to 2 questions if they choose. Candidates will be allowed 2 minutes for a closing statement. So we will begin with we will begin with Mrs. Houle with your opening statement.
Okay. Hello, my name is Tammy Houle, as was mentioned earlier. I'm from right outside the Redwood Falls area, just to the east of Redwood Falls in Paxton Township. I'm married. My husband's name is Doug. We've been married for almost 28 years. We have 3 children, all grown, 1 married, and the youngest going into her 2nd year of college. I home educated all of my children until they began their college work. I work for the University of Minnesota by way of Renville County Extension Office in Olivia. I have been a township official for 27 years, and recently was elected to represent the township officials in 8 counties on the State Board of Township Directors. I have a passion for public service, as you can tell by my long history with township work. I believe in transparency, accountability, and accessibility. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Fool. Representative Torkelson.
Well, thank you, Diane. Good evening, and thanks for taking an interest in Minnesota politics. My name is Paul Torkelson, and I'm the endorsed Republican candidate for District 16B. I'm finishing my 6th term in the Minnesota House of Representatives, and I hope to be elected to a 7th term this November. The next step on that journey is the upcoming primary on August 11th, and I hope all of you take the time to vote, whether it's at your mailbox or at the ballot box. It has truly been an honor to serve my constituents and represent them at the Capitol. I am proud of my record over these last 12 years representing my district and dealing with some of the most challenging issues of the day. My efforts have been rewarded with 6 consecutive victories and endorsements by many organizations, including Minnesota Farm Bureau and Minnesota Chamber of Commerce. This year, I have received renewed endorsements from the Minnesota Citizens Concerned for Life, the National Federation of Independent Business, and the Minnesota Gun Owners Caucus. A candidate needs to stand up for important issues, and I do. I have a pro-life agenda. I am supporting agriculture and our rural way of life. I am for protecting our Second Amendment rights. I am for fair funding of our rural schools, and I am for making Minnesota a business-friendly state. I look forward to responding to your questions tonight, and feel free to contact me at any time.
Thank you, Mr. Torkelson. We will begin with the first 2 questions that were drafted by the League of Women Voters, New Ulm, and they were provided to you in advance. Again, a reminder, email address lvwnewulm@lwvmn.org or call 507-276-6140 and 507-766-9581. The first question, and we will begin with Mrs. Houle. Family farmers continue to experience record low prices for corn, soybeans, and dairy. What would you do as a legislator to stabilize the farm economy and provide opportunities for the next generation of family farmers? How do you feel your approach differs from the approach of your opponent?
I think the key phrase in that question is family farms. We must strive to preserve and protect our family farms, which are the bedrock and backbone of our rural communities. We have to facilitate an environment where young farmers can thrive and are motivated to be here and stay here. We have to reward innovation and not hinder it. There are new methods and new crops that we can encourage, cutting-edge initiatives. If these young farmers want to pursue those avenues, I've heard of no-till, or have been learning about no-till and strip tillage regenerative farming, and that reduces erosion, restores nutrients to the soil while retaining moisture. I'd like to see that be developed and more young farmers pursue that avenue. I'd also like to see them pursue new crops like the hemp. I have a friend nearby where I live in Redwood County that is beginning a hemp operation, and I am really encourage him and support him, and I would like to see an end to where he is has to fear that if he has just too much THC in his hemp, that the Department of Ag can come in and confiscate and chop all his hemp down. I think that is outrageous, and I think we need to put a barrier to that. One thing that I will never do if I am elected and that is to trample and take away property rights, as my opponent did with the buffer bill. He initiated and pushed through during a session when the Republicans had the House majority. If elected, I would stand alongside other legislators in their efforts to repeal this legislation and find alternate means to protect water quality.
Thank you. Mr. Torkelson.
Well, thank you. There's a number of things at the state level that we've been working on very recently. The first and foremost is federal tax code conformity. Section 179 is the byword for it, but it really deals with depreciation for farmers that have traded equipment and are subject to thousands of dollars in unforeseen tax bills. We're very close to fixing that. We may get it fixed in the next special session. I hope we do. Minnesota's been a leader in the ethanol and biodiesel industry. Those uses for our crops are really what saved us in these last few months of low prices. Without those, we'd have really low prices. State support for those programs is really important. Animal agriculture, of course, is very important to Minnesota agriculture. We've seen a near crisis in our processing industry, but it seems like the state has handled that quite well, keeping our plants open, and I hope that that effort continues so that we process the animals that we're growing. And finally, avoiding unnecessary regulation is really important. My opponent brought up the buffer issue. We could spend all night talking about it. I'd just remind people that it wasn't my initiative. It was Governor Dayton's initiative. He wanted 50-foot buffers everywhere. We worked hard to get the buffer bill down to something that was quite reasonable. The 16.5-foot buffers on public ditches has been in state law since 1976.
Thank you. The second question is, and we will start with Representative Torkelson. Describe your plans for leading our state through the COVID crisis.
Well, thank you. This is another topic that we could spend the rest of the night on.
No small topic.
Right now, our ability to lead the state through the COVID crisis is quite limited because the governor has his hands on the wheel. We believe that the governor should be working in partnership with the legislature, both House and Senate, but so far that has not been the case. He continues to have these special executive powers. They have to end someday. We are not interested in eliminating all of his special orders. We're interested in working with the governor to transition out of this situation where the governor has the authority really to legislate without the legislature. Other issues with COVID-19. It's really important that we protect our most vulnerable citizens, and I really applaud the nursing homes in my district that have done a great job of protecting their residents, unlike other parts of the state where we've seen the highest number of deaths occurring among the elderly in long-term care. That has not been the case here, and I hope we can, and I know we will continue that because the folks that work in that industry in this part of the state have done a great job. We heard today, of course, about the mask mandate from the governor. I have mixed feelings about that. I'm not opposed to masks. I think they have some value, but they are not a cure-all. And if we think that only wearing masks is the way out of this, it's just one step. We need to encourage safe behaviors. We need to stay in our bubbles as much as possible. And I hope that there's some way that we can open our schools. I really feel bad for our teachers and students. Just imagine if you were an elementary teacher who had never even met your students and were expected to start online classes. I spent some time with a 6th grade class online. About a third of them had their picture up. The rest didn't. I can't imagine how hard it is for the teacher to work in that environment.
Thank you. Mrs. Houle?
There is a lot of conflicting data and models out there right now, and it's really hard to know who to trust. And if we just depend on the mainstream media, I don't think we're getting a comprehensive picture, and I think we are fortunate to have the World Wide Web that you can go out and do some research for yourself. In Minnesota, I think the intended cure has been more grave than the illness. I believe the governor has usurped the authority of the Minnesota Legislature and the checks and balances provided by the Minnesota Constitution. The governor does not have the authority to suspend the constitutional rights of Minnesotans indefinitely. The peacetime emergency declarations were designed to address immediate crisis, which requires specific, swift action, such as with a flood or a tornado. By contrast, a public health crisis can last for an indefinite amount of time, and the governor's executive orders have covered a far broader scope of actions than should be allowed. Has the fear been justified? Yes, COVID is real. People have perished. And yes, we need to take measures to protect the most vulnerable. Was the actual risk of harm and death posed by this pathogen to ordinary healthy individuals? The vast majority of people who succumbed to this were either elderly or have at least one serious pre-existing health condition. And I believe the number of COVID deaths has been and is being artificially inflated. We saw that exposed by our own Minnesota Senator, Dr. Scott Jensen. I think that we need to look at that statute, that peacetime emergency powers statute, and make adjustments in the future. I believe we need to follow in the example of our neighbors to the west, South, and North Dakota, because the numbers show that Minnesota has higher rates of unemployment and deaths per capita from COVID than free states who have not been in a continual lockdown.
Thank you. This question that came in follows along basically with what you said, Mrs. Houle. So I will read it and then, and you're first, right? Yeah. And then go to Representative Torkelson. So the question reads, science has proven that the best way to protect yourself and others from COVID contracting is to wear a mask. Knowing this, do you support the governor's mask mandate? And we'll start with you since you were actually just talking about it.
Okay. As I mentioned earlier, I believe there's an opportunity for us to do research and not just trust the politicians and the doctors acting as politicians who are saying that masks are effective. There is a host of scientific data that shows that simply isn't true and can in fact lead to a greater chance of infection. Dr. Michael Osterholm, right here at the University of Minnesota, he was also former intern director of the CDC, has said about the CDC's recent support for masks. Never before in my 45-year career have I seen such a far-reaching public recommendation issued by any government agency without a single source of data or information to support it. And he was talking about the mask mandate. In March, the World Health Organization said, this is March, mind you, said there is currently no evidence that wearing a mask by healthy persons in the wider community setting can protect them from infection with respiratory viruses, including COVID-19. Now, fast forward to July 12th, and the World Health Organization reversed its advice. How did the science change in those months, and why weren't they recommending the masks if they were effective from the very start? Why, after 4 months into it, are we having this change of recommendation? They have reversed their stance from don't wear to wear them now. And there's other places that have said that the masks are not effective. OSHA, their website says, they will not protect the wearer against airborne transmittable infectious agents due to loose fit and lack of seal or inadequate filtration. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Torkelson.
Well, thank you. The mask question, it's one that we've been wrestling with as a society now for quite some time. I think it's important to note that the masks do not protect you from getting the disease as much as they protect others from you if you happen to be infectious. And one of the big problems with this disease is that people don't know when they're infectious. The studies show that you can be asymptomatic for quite some time, and even though you're asymptomatic, you can be shedding virus, and there are some people that have been proven to be super shedders. Now, we don't know who they are, and that's why the masks aren't necessarily a horrible idea. There's certainly going to be some resistance to wearing masks, we know that. And the governor's order does not include the outdoors, which I am very happy about because I think we're all pretty safe as long as we're outdoors and reasonably separated from other people. And even the president came out just yesterday, I believe, to state that he thought that wearing masks was a good idea, which was a big switch for the president and a big switch for our society. I would like to see more of a regional approach to the COVID-19 situation here in Minnesota. If you look at the statistics, many of our rural counties just don't have the incidence or the illness that we do in the more populous parts of our state. We have neighboring states like South Dakota and now Wisconsin that have very limited regulations and seem to be doing quite well. I think the more wide open parts of our state could have a more relaxed approach. We should target our efforts more than we have been. One size does not fit all.
Thank you. The next questions are not about, yes, Mrs. Fool, rebuttal.
Whoops, one. Okay, I want to make it clear that I am concerned and care about those who are vulnerable. And even though I am opposed to a blanket mandate for everyone to wear masks, I believe that we have to be responsible for our own health and not have the government mandate these things. I do care. As a township official, I'm the head election judge. I'm going to tell you a little story. In my precinct, one of my fellow township officials has some unknown health concerns. In fact, he's in Rochester this week finding out what those are. And I asked him personally to consider not being an election judge for the primary on August 11th because I was concerned. And I left it up to him to make the decision whether he would do that or not, be an election judge. He chose to be an election judge. Allowed him to make that choice. I was concerned for his well-being.
Thank you. The next questions are also somewhat about health issues. And we will start with Representative Torkelson. Flavored tobacco products are contributing to a youth tobacco epidemic and disproportionately harming diverse communities, people of color. Do you support prohibiting the sale of all flavored tobacco products, such as menthol cigarettes, cherry chew, and flavored vapes or e-cigarettes?
Well, thank you for that question. The tobacco products that are aimed specifically at children, I believe, are over the line and should be controlled. To take them completely off the market is maybe a step too far, but we do control tobacco pretty carefully. I think we could control it a little better and make sure that we keep these products that are obviously targeted at children out of their hands. We know how addictive nicotine is. Nicotine is actually more addictive, according to some studies, than heroin. And for some people, once they're hooked, and they really, as many people know, stopping smoking is a real serious challenge for many of our citizens, and the health impacts are real. But this question kind of goes beyond that too. We're seeing a big push in Minnesota to legalize marijuana. I think it's a mistake. I don't think that's the right approach. More drugs is not what we need. What we need is people to avoid these impacts of these drugs that can be so damaging to their health.
Thank you. Mrs. Houle.
I think it is appropriate to protect children, and especially in their vulnerable years. And I think it is appropriate to regulate when they can be allowed to purchase these. And so if that is regulated so that they cannot purchase until they're of adult age, even though it's marketed to young people, I think that we need to protect them because they, as Representative Torkelson said, they can experiment with these things, and then it can lead to other things that come along. And nicotine is very addicting, and we have seen some very traumatic results. Seen young people in the hospital. I think it was Carol Levin did a segment on a young man that nearly lost his life because of vaping. And I think we need to be very careful about how we allow that to be marketed and and the children having access to it. Thank you.
Thank you. The next question is about tobacco prevention funding, and we will start with Mrs. Wool. Tobacco prevention funding is rapidly declining, even though youth tobacco use rates are increasing. Minnesota currently spends less than 1% of the state's $700 million of annual tobacco revenue on health. Do you support increasing state funding for prevention of youth tobacco and e-cigarette use?
I guess I will answer that by relating a story. I've been very involved in 4-H for a very long time with all my children, and we actually had a woman come and talk to the youth in our county in 4-H about tobacco and tobacco prevention, and I was very disturbed by the message that she gave. Unfortunately, the whole gist of the program was just take notice. I'm not sure if that's the exact verbatim, but the gist of it was she was telling the kids to go into their local convenience store and notice how much advertising was being done to them all over, and she was recommending that they actually notice the advertising directed and targeted at them and how they were being targeted. And I thought, well, whose side is she on? I didn't really understand that program, and if that is the gist of the kind of prevention that we're trying to provide, then I would be very highly opposed to that. I don't know if that program is still in operation. That's been a few years ago, I want to say 7-8 years ago, but it was very disturbing to me that the message was just take notice, and she was directing the kids to actually go into the local convenience store and notice all the advertising that was directed at them. That was not acceptable. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Torkelson.
Well, thank you. I can't say that I'm intimately familiar with the current programs that are in place. I know that we do have some prevention programs that are ongoing, and I would support the continuation of those. Whether or not we could add more funds to that issue area or not, I honestly don't know. What I do know is that we are going to be facing a huge budget deficit in the next biennium, and finding money for new programs in a deficit situation is really, really challenging, almost impossible. But improving existing programs is something we can do. If the program's been in place for a while, taking a look at it and making sure that it's effective and properly administered and is actually reaching its goals is something we should do on a regular basis. I'm a big believer in continuous quality improvement. So if you've got a good program, that's great, but it can always be better, and evaluating what's going on is certainly important. But when it comes to money, I'm afraid that we're facing a real serious challenge in the next biennium. I was around at the legislature when we had an over $6 billion deficit a few years ago. I know how challenging it was to deal with that. Some folks are anticipating that we may have as much as a $9 or $10 billion deficit in the next biennium. That will be our biggest challenge, and finding money for new programs will be next to impossible.
Thank you. The next question, and we'll start with Mr. Torkelson. What have you done, or what will you do, to ensure the work of the legislature is completed during regular session in a timely fashion, as opposed to going into special sessions? And we'll start with you.
What a year to ask that question.
Yes.
As I think most people know, we are locked into a series of special sessions. Partly, we're really because of the governor's special executive powers. We have to come back every 30 days to have a chance to end those powers. But every time we've tried to do that, the Minnesota House DFL has voted not to end his powers, so we continue for another 30 days. I fully expect we'll be back in the middle of August for another round of that sort of legislation. But the underlying question is really the important one, is how do we get done in a timely fashion? The legislature has taken a look at that, and so far I would have to say we have not succeeded in figuring that out. Deadlines matter. Deadlines seem to help us get our work done, but it doesn't always work. So I have tried in my work at the legislature to get my work done in a timely fashion. And that's always been my goal. I can remember when I was chair of the Capital Investment Committee, the committee that does the bonding bill, I sat down with my staff and the nonpartisan staff in the House when I got that chairmanship, and I said, I want to finish this in an orderly fashion. I want you to tell me how many days you need to properly write the bill. I want to know how many days it takes to assemble those pieces and get them to the floor in good shape. I had a great goal in mind, but frankly, it didn't work. It got pushed to the very end, to the very last minute, in spite of my efforts. It's a tough hill to climb. Avoiding putting everything into one bill would help, I think, if we had to pass those bills in a more timely fashion. And moving up some of those deadlines so that would leave us a little time after the deadline to work would also be helpful.
Thank you, Mr. Torkelson. Mrs. Houle.
Well, I've never been in the legislature at this point, so I am not completely sure how they arrange schedules up there. But as a township official, I have been at the Capitol lobbying for township government and township concerns. And I've been there at the early part of the session, and there's a very laid-back, lackadaisical atmosphere at the get-go of the session, and I don't know how far into it where they really bear down and seem to get to work, but I was always surprised at how laid back it is, and then later it seems like there's this big push and there's this big scramble. And since Representative Torkelson mentioned the omnibus bills, where so many multi-subject things are put into the same bill, I find those highly reprehensible. I would push to do with an end to omnibus bills. I believe that they are unconstitutional. Our Constitution calls for a single subject so that there is accountability, and I believe with the omnibus bills, the legislators can skirt around accountability for the many, many subjects that they vote on in one bill. So I am also concerned about the time spent between these special sessions, where the governor and our Speaker of the House, Kurt Dowd, go behind closed doors and work out deals, and then they come back and expect their caucuses to just rubber stamp the deal they've worked out. That's very concerning to me. I don't think that is appropriate, and I would like to see an end to these deal-making sessions behind closed doors.
Thank you. Rebuttal, Mr. Torkelson.
Thank you, Diane. I appreciate that. I don't know which committee meetings Mrs. Houle attended, but I don't think she attended mine when I was chair of capital investment or chair of transportation. There was nothing lackadaisical about the schedule. We have an intense schedule in my committees from day one. There's a lot of ground to cover. There's a lot of presentations to be made, a lot of people's voices to be heard, and that work is intense from the very first committee meeting, at least in the committees that I've chaired. And as far as deal making goes, it's very challenging to get to yes. And I've been in the small room sometimes when it comes down to those last few points, and it's not easy, and it's impossible to do without real serious commitment from both sides to reach an agreement.
Thank you. The next question, and we will start with Mr. Torkelson. The next question is, how will you or how have you ensured state workers retain jobs to reduce layoffs since they are part of our economy and communities?
Thank you. Is that it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Would you like me to repeat it?
No, I think I've got it.
Okay.
The state payroll has been growing. The state government's been growing. We have more employees on the state payroll all the time. I spoke earlier about the challenges that are ahead of us with a budget deficit. To think that we can maintain every job in state government in the face of billions of dollars of deficit is unreasonable. Even the governor has already imposed a hiring freeze to start the process of slimming down, and it's going to have to continue. I wish it didn't. I value our state employees. Many of them work very hard. All of them work very hard, I hope. And it's a shame that we will have to make some cuts, but I think they're coming. I could be wrong. Perhaps the economy will recover very quickly, and perhaps we'll see more money coming from the federal government. But this is a challenging area, and I'm honestly not looking forward to the hard work that's going to have to be done to balance our budget, and much of our budget is employees. And I will tell the story. After the last election, when we lost the majority, I was asked to chair our caucus personnel committee, and we had to cut about half of our 80 employees. And it was my job to tell half of our people that they didn't have a job anymore. It was the most heart-wrenching thing I've done in state government, to tell good people that you don't have a job.
Thank you. Mrs. Houle.
I think we are in dire straits right now. I think after the last few months of this COVID crisis, we have seen a very difficult economic turndown in our state, and many, many people have lost jobs. And I think it's unrealistic to think that people in the public sector should not have to face the hardships that people in the private sector have had to face in the last few months. I know for the most part, I don't think during this crisis that there were many public employees that lost their jobs because they were deemed essential in an atmosphere where others not in the private sector or public sector were deemed non-essential and lost their positions, which was very, very wrong and very unfair. And so I am a public employee myself, and if the county of Renville had to cut their budget because of the hardships that we have seen in the last few months, as hard as it would be to leave my job, I would have to understand that there are others in the private sector that have endured great hardship by loss of job and don't even know when they may be able to go back. And so, as I agree with Representative Torkelson, there may have to be cuts made to the state budget through all of this. That is, and there may be cutbacks, just like there has been in the public sector. Thank you.
Thank you. The next question, and we'll start with Mrs. Houle. Are you in favor of a tip credit for restaurant workers? This is in regards to the $10 minimum wage for restaurants. Why or why not?
I guess I would have to say that I would be opposed to that. I'm not sure if I completely understand what a tip credit is. I'm assuming that means that it would be an actual tip that would be applied to the bill, and it would not be left up to the individual to determine the amount that they want to tip a restaurant worker. I'm opposed to mandatory minimum wage, and I think this falls in the same category if I understand the question correctly. I have worked in restaurant work myself, and I understand that that many times they make more through tips than they actually do through their wages. But I think the people in our state particularly are very generous and benevolent people, and they are very prone to give generously. And I don't think it would have to be made a mandate, if that is exactly what the question means. I'm not sure. Thank you.
Mr. Torkelson.
Well, thank you for that question. It's a little hard to even think about right now because I know that most of our servers are really in dire straits. Our restaurants have been closed for a long time, and even those that are open now are only open partially. They can only be open to a percentage of their normal business. So someone who depends on tips and waiting tables for a living has been challenged dramatically to make a living. And once unemployment runs out, and if this situation hasn't changed dramatically, it could be very challenging. Really, the background to this is the disparity within a restaurant between those who face the public and can earn tips and those behind the scenes that do all the work and don't earn tips. And depending on the restaurant, sometimes tips are shared, sometimes they're not. If you look at other states, there are some states that pay waitresses as little as $2 and something an hour, depending on the fact that they're going to get big tips to make up the difference. It's if there's going to be a minimum wage increase, I think the way tips relate with that is important, and we should do the best job we can to make it fair to both the front house staff and the back of the house staff, so that everyone who makes a restaurant click is compensated as fairly as possible.
Thank you. The next question is, and we will start with you, Mr. Torkelson. Given that we are in a pandemic that attacks our lungs, what are you or what would you do to support clean air in Minnesota?
Well, I don't serve on the Environment Committee anymore, but I did. Learned quite a bit about clean air in the process. I think here in Minnesota we actually do a pretty good job of regulating air pollution. It's not evenly distributed across the state, of course. Some of the more populated areas of the state have more problems with air pollution than others. But the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency does a pretty good job. In fact, sometimes I think they get a little carried away. We've had incidences where equipment, I'm thinking now of the ethanol plants that I've dealt with over my years at the legislature. There have been times when equipment that's working just fine they've had to either not install it or reinstall it because it didn't have the exact proper code on it, even though it wasn't polluting. They had to make expensive changes within these plants. In one case, they even, to meet the PCA's targets, they had to vacuum the cement. When you're out in the countryside, in a dusty environment already. Vacuuming cement just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I think it's really important that our state agencies apply their authority properly and with good common sense. That has not always been the case in the area of air quality.
Thank you. Mrs. Houle.
I think that our Minnesota Pollution Control is doing a okay job from what I understand. As a township official, I know that for the crop dusting, that there are regulations in place for protecting the spread of when they can crop dust, so that it has to be a certain non-windy day so it doesn't fly into other areas. I think they do a good job regulating the hog operations and the turkey operations to keep them at a safe distance from the odors that would pollute the air from residents. So I'm not aware that we need to work on that more, but I will be very conscious of that if there is an issue to have it addressed, especially representing a rural community such as 16B. Thank you.
Thank you. Here is another question, and we'll start with Mrs. Houle. Are you in favor of changing Minnesota tax depreciation regulations to bring them into compliance with federal tax laws?
I'm not sure how we're out of compliance with federal tax laws. I do know that in Minnesota we tax Social Security, and the neighboring state of Wisconsin does not. That is concerning to me, especially as I near that age when I'll be collecting Social Security, and I just wonder, that is an area that I really need to research, and I'm not sure. I honestly would have to do research in that area.
Thank you.
Well,
Mr.
thanks for that
Torkelson.
question. I know if you want to put people to sleep, start talking about the details of the tax code. It gets involved very quickly into language that most people don't even want to hear. But this is the exact issue that I talked about early in the evening. It's that Section 179 issue. What's happened is as the federal tax code has changed in relation to depreciation, Minnesota tax code has not. So farmers like me have to keep two depreciation schedules, one for the federal government and a second one for the state government, adding to expense and bookkeeping expenses. Also, that means that the tax impacts are varied depending on whether it hits your federal income tax or your state income tax. But the real current problem is when they changed the federal code the last time and we didn't comply, farmers that traded equipment all of a sudden had a tax bill, got tax bills from the Department of Revenue for thousands of dollars because Minnesota did not recognize the value of the trade the same way that the federal government did. So they had to take that value of their traded in piece of equipment as income, and that caused a bump in their income, which presented them with a big tax bill, thousands of dollars in many cases. Now, over the long term, it kind of all evens out because that's the way depreciation works. But in the short term, it really caused serious problems at a time when farmers are really struggling and coming up with thousands of dollars, extra dollars right now to pay a tax bill, put them in a position in many cases where their banker is saying, wait a minute, I don't know that we want to put more money into your operation right now. And that means a real struggle for farmers. It's one thing that we were trying to fix all session. We thought we had a agreement with the governor that we'd do the bonding bill and this tax bill together that included that fix for Section 179, but so far it has not happened. I hope it does. We have another shot coming in August, and I'm hoping we get there.
Thank you. That is the end of the questions that I have. So each of you will have 2 minutes to give a closing. 1 minute. Sorry. 1 minute. Bad news. 1 minute to give a closing statement, and we will start with Mr. Torkelson.
First, I would like to thank the League of Women Voters for hosting tonight's event and thank my opponent for an informative discussion. I also want to express my heartfelt appreciation for the opportunity to represent you in St. Paul. Because of COVID-19, this campaign is going to be different than anything we have seen in the past. But should our campaign prevail, I look forward to serving you in the years ahead. During my time in the Minnesota House, I have worked hard to rein in wasteful government spending. I want to allow you to keep more of what you earn. Preserve your liberties, protect your Second Amendment freedoms, and fight for the rights of the unborn. I work to unite, not to divide, and I passionately believe that Minnesota can and will be up to the task of dealing with the challenges before us. I am here tonight asking for your vote. Thanks again for listening, and don't forget to take part in the August 11th primary.
Thank you. Mrs. Houle.
I too thank the League of Women Voters here in New Ulm for hosting, and I thank my opponent, Representative Torkelson. I would like to say that my core convictions tell me there's not another option than to get involved with what is happening in our state. Running for this seat is so much bigger than representing District 16B. I'm running to preserve freedom. Our civil liberties are being stripped away. We are being taxed to death, and the ever-increasing size of government is making the idea of liberty seem impossible. If I fail in this election, what more do I have to lose? I am really surprised that Representative Torkelson has gotten a pro-life endorsement from MCCL because he has voted to fund Planned Parenthood through the omnibus bill in many sessions, and I would like to see him be more accessible as a township official. I have not seen him come to any of our township meetings since he was first elected. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. This concludes our House 16B forum for this evening. The League of Women Voters of New Ulm thanks you for your participation this evening, and we want to thank the candidates for sharing their views and their willingness to run for office. Thanks also goes to our question screeners and timers, to the NCAT New Ulm Community Access TV crew, KNUJ, and the New Ulm Journal. If you need to register to vote or need more information on elections, talk to one of our members here tonight. In addition, you can find comprehensive information about elections in Minnesota at www. capital M, capital N, capital V, OTES, minvotes.org. Remember that the primary election is August 11th, and Election Day is November 3rd. Be sure to vote. Thank you and good night.